Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm hoping that you can all see this and hear this well. Just so that you know, the lecture is going to be recorded, and so we'll post the link to that on the Urban Cultures site and on Twitter as well. So I'd just like to give a very warm welcome to everybody to the first of our Urban Cultures lecture series, seminar series for 2021-22. And although we're delighted to be back in person in so many formats, we're finding this digital format really excellent for allowing people access to a much wider kind of set of debates. So yeah, the Urban Cultures Research Cluster is really our opportunity to explore research across the scales in the environment, in cities and towns, and we are a research cluster situated in Birmingham City University, and across disciplines from architecture, landscape, interior architecture, product design, and research management. And these debates are a great opportunity for us to showcase the kind of work that we're doing, and as well as for us to invite other external speakers. And the first of these that I'm introducing today will be David Capener, who I think crosses over in his role, in the sense that he's talking about work that he was involved with before joining us at BCU, in setting up the Irish Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. So David seems to me to be a Renaissance man. You know, he's an architect, an educator, theorist. You know, writes for the media as well. And yeah, I'm really excited to introduce him. And David, over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. It's the first time I've been introduced as a Renaissance man, so I'm happy with that. Thank you. Just before I begin, I just want to give a bit of context for this project that is still on show at the Venice Biennale in Venice, and I'm one of the curators, one of 6 curators. I'm part of a group called Annex, suitably called because we all have a little annex to our own existing research and work that we carry out, and that over the past few years has been to produce, to curate and design and make the Irish Pavilion at the Venice Biennale. So there's 6 of us. I'm one of the 6, and there's also an artist called Alan Butler. There's a researcher from Trinity College in Dublin called Fiona McDermott, associate professor at the University of Chicago, associate professor of architecture, Claire Lister, Donal Lally, who's also a researcher and lecturer at Technological University in Dublin, and sound artist and consultant Sven Anderson. So we're a multidisciplinary team. It's not just me, but I get the pleasure of presenting our work to you today. And as I do that, I'm just going to switch over to another screen here. Here's the film that we made of our pavilion in Venice. I don't know how much of that you saw. The irony is that the project we built deals with the topics of data infrastructure. So even in presenting this talk, we realised the limitations of data infrastructure. But this is what we've built in Venice, it's as I've already mentioned, a performative installation that quite literally performs the processes of the cloud. And in building this structure, we wanted to subvert the sleek utopia of the techno sublime and show that behind every tweet, click, like, and download are a multiplicity of material processes and physical infrastructures. And we wanted to show that the cloud is material, that the cloud is dirty, and that the cloud is a hungry and thirsty object. This is, of course, a global story. It's also a very Irish story, hence the Irish Pavilion. 150 years ago, the world's first transatlantic cable landed on Valentia Island in County Kerry, which is on the southwest coast of Ireland. This is sparsely populated rural island in a nation still recovering from the Great Famine became this communication node between two empires, a massive technological achievement that has since been likened to the moon landing. The then mayor of New York said that a small suburb, a small town in Kerry had become a suburb of New York. This small cable embedded in Valentia slate that you can see here on this image, which forms part of our pavilion, is arguably the beginning of the story of the internet. This is actually a slice of the world's first transatlantic telecommunications cable. The table from which the first transatlantic message was sent was made from this very slate. But this 150-year-old cable also tells another part of the story of data infrastructure, one that is often masked behind the sleek marketing aesthetic of the cloud. This tiny slither of cable tells the entangled story of the materiality of data infrastructure, and what some scholars have called the first Victorian ecological disaster. The black that you see around the cable in this image acted as an insulant, literally insulating the heat of global telecommunication signals, was this black rubber, which was harvested from the gutta percha tree in Malaysia. So much of it was harvested that the tree very nearly became extinct and today remains on the endangered list. A single tree could yield about 300 grams of latex. The first transatlantic cable was around 3,000 kilometers long and weighed 2,000 tons, requiring around 250 tons of gutta percha. To produce just 1 ton of this material required about 900,000 tree trunks, which is why our installation, which literally performs the processes of data infrastructure and manifests the materiality of the cloud, has been designed to tend to a similar plant that in its past story it nearly made extinct. This is not just an old story. Today, Dublin is one of the 4 data center capitals of Europe. By the end of the decade, data centers alone are forecast to consume roughly 1/3 of all of Ireland's electricity. A new Amazon data center currently being built in a place called Mulhuddet will be equivalent in size to 3 football pitches and will consume 0.5% of Ireland's total electricity market. The same site has been master planned to account for an additional 7 more data centers. And contrary to what big technology companies would like you to believe, the majority of this electricity comes from fossil fuel sources. All downloading of data is literally an uploading of the Earth's resources. There's also this Amazon data center in Tella, which is a suburb of Dublin, which hilariously, when I was working on a piece for The Guardian, I was told by Amazon's press office that this data center didn't exist, even though I told them that I had the planning permission documents in front of me that they had signed. So this particular data center is part of a complex that is interesting to us. One of the reasons why data centers have such an extraordinarily large ecological footprint is that the production of data is also the production of vast amounts of heat. Thousands and thousands of servers housed in server frames, the fundamental architectural typology of our age, out of which we built our structure, produce enormous amounts of heat, which require enormous amounts of cooling. Amazon, who are building another data center on this site, were told that the only way they could get planning permission for this facility was if they built a community heating system, which would use the waste heat from the data center to heat local homes, an art gallery, a hospital, a college campus building, and other buildings in the area, creating this kind of strange and bizarre entanglement. The act of someone watching The Irishman on Netflix in their apartment in Berlin produces a puff of heat from a server in Thaler that heats a hospital ward. Rather than the slick, techno-sublime aesthetic that the data center industry would have you believe, the reality is something quite different. These are incredibly noisy, dark, cold, and hostile spaces. Data centers are incredibly volatile spaces. They are in essence a battle between hot and cold, and when heat wins, it can be catastrophic, like this recent data center fire in France that took down tens of millions of websites. The cloud is material, but the cloud is also very fragile. This is why we chose to tell the story of the materiality of the cloud through the prism of heat, because the production and dissemination of data is also the production and dissemination of heat. The oldest form of technology, fire, around which the earliest communities gathered and lands were territorialized, remains central to contemporary technologies. You're now looking at thermal drone footage that we commissioned. We commissioned hours of this footage of many of Ireland's largest data centers. And we wanted to use this machine vision system to look beyond the architecture skin and reveal the invisible materiality of data processing, materiality that is usually imperceptible to the human eye. And as the drone lifts, in the background of this image, you see a data center, a mixture of extraordinarily hot areas and extraordinarily cold areas, foregrounding this contestation between hot and cold and the production of data. While our installation is about the places that facilitate data infrastructure, it is also about the processes that data infrastructure performs. In fact, the two, place and process, cannot be separated. One process that is very much connected to the continual contestation that is the production of public space is artificial intelligence, which is another part of our installation. We wanted our installation to be able to speak about its own subject matter. So we developed a machine learning algorithm, fed the algorithm with over 10 million words on the topic of data infrastructure, so it could begin to learn to speak about itself and learn how to speak over the course of the Biennale. Sometimes it makes no sense at all, like this image on the right from when I was in Venice a few weeks ago, when at one point the AI started talking about sperm whales. And then sometimes it starts to speak words that sound like they might begin to make sense. And I'll finish with one of our favorite quotes from our AI, that the cloud is a hungry and thirsty object. If you're interested in finding out more about our work and you can't get to Venice, then you can buy our book from absolutely no good booksellers, but ironically it is available to buy from Amazon. And this book tells the story from start to finish of the construction of the pavilion and all the research that has gone into it. It has a number of other really, really great and interesting contributors. So that book is available to buy. And there's another image of our pavilion. I will post the film link in the chat for you all to see, so you can experience how performative and noisy and how material our installation is in the space in Venice. Back over to you, Rachel.
Muted, Rachel.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I did the classic unmute myself. It's first of all, I'd just like to ask you a question that's come up in the chat. which is that there are data centers managing cryptocurrency as well, aren't there? Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, well, there's these places get called data center mines, and they have an extraordinarily short shelf life. The computational power that's required is absolutely huge. There was something in the press this week that just one Bitcoin transaction is the equivalent to throwing away 2 iPhones, so it has the same kind of environmental footprint. If we want to talk about the ecological footprint of data infrastructure, which is completely entangled with this bizarre and new strange world of kind of economics, and new forms of transaction, then Bitcoin is one to talk about. But also interestingly, these Bitcoin mines appear in really bizarre and strange places, like in tower blocks, in apartments, in the middle of the jungle. I mean, if you Google Bitcoin mine locations, you'll see these rather strange kind of ramshackle structures and little sort of temporal pieces of architecture that facilitate these enormously powerful computers that are generating kind of financial transactions around the world that are often worth millions.
I'd like to ask, people, or invite people very much to post their questions in the chat. I can pass those questions on to David. But in the meantime, I suppose it's a kind of tricky question, David, but I'm kind of interested to know what you think, apart from the criticality, but what do you think this, I don't know, prompts us to do as architects? Yeah, I understand there's a critical role as an architect, particularly when you're involved in the Venice Biennale, which is a very open kind of event that's going to invite discussion from a lot of people. But is there any kind of wider implications that you think that we ought to be thinking about within the practice and the profession?
Yeah, first of all, I'll just sort of situate that question in the context of our piece of work, which is we were very clear we didn't set out to propose a kind of utopian solution. Not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that. We simply set out to ask the questions that we feel need asked, and secondly, that we are a multidisciplinary team is important, because the complexity of the problem that we face, or the problems that we face, require a multidisciplinary response. Where some of this stuff lands, in particular for architects and those in and around the architecture profession, is the deployment of these kinds of technologies in the urban environment. So increasingly, the major investments that companies like Google Alphabet are now making are in the deployment of sensing, data extraction technologies in the domestic sphere and also in the urban environment. So the very notion of what we understand to be public space, for example, has already radically changed and radically transformed. We all walk around with sensing data mining devices in our pocket. So one of the things we're getting our students to explore this year is the idea that public space doesn't exist. I mean, it never has done, but actually data infrastructure and new technologies kind of foreground that public space is always a continual contestation for the performance of public space. And when these kinds of technologies, as numerous pieces of research have shown, dictate how we use public, or how we use the city in everyday life, what we do, how we perceive the city, how the city is represented to us through certain platforms like Instagram or Google Maps or whatever else it might be. You know, these are questions that we believe, that I believe architects need to begin to consider, particularly if we have a concern, as I believe we should do, for the production of space that is accessible toward the democratic production of space and the right to the city.
I think one of the questions or comments posted in the chat is really from Grant Morris that says, well, it's ironic that we use these things every day in practice as well. So we're absolutely complicit as a part of the process of this stuff.
We are, yeah. But there are things we can do to become less complicit. I mean, because we are complicit doesn't mean that we can't call these things into question. You know, it's the old story of the fish in water, and an older fish comes the other way and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the fish answers, "Well, what the hell is water?" You know, we can become so immersed in our context and our surroundings that we kind of have no knowledge of what that might be. But what we want to do with a piece like this is to call those things into the discourse and say we need to talk about these things.
Absolutely. Another small question I had when you were talking about the denial, I think by Amazon, that their building existed. Was it Amazon or Google?
Amazon.
Is that on Google Earth? Do these things get shown?
Oh yeah, it's on Google Earth. Yeah, WikiLeaks published a list as well a number of years ago of Amazon data centers around the world. They are becoming more open about where their data centers exist, but yeah, they were very, very clear it didn't exist. It's all a bit kind of emperor's new clothes, really. I mean, this huge facility built on the back of a planning permission that they signed by AWS, Amazon Web Services. So yeah, it's a bit of a weird one, but yeah, but that is what happened.
Fascinating. And David, did you you showed some, you know, very dramatic photos of the interior. Did you get to visit, or are these photographs that are somehow publicly available?
You mean like this one? Can you see that one?
It's taking a while. I'm not seeing anything but your lovely. Oh yes, there it is. Yeah, that one.
Okay, so this is an example of the kind of techno sublime marketing aesthetic that the data center industry wants you to believe that most data centers are like. So this is the kind of thing we're trying to subvert. You know, it's interesting. You know, the majority of data centers do not look like this. They're dark, they're cold, they're volatile and noisy spaces. And also to note, if you Google data center interiors, the only kinds of images that come up are these images, and you'll be hard pressed to find any people in these images. That's because people are the primary source of outages in data centers. So the data center industry doesn't want to position people within these machine landscapes because people are primarily the cause of outages. And actually, generally, these data centers don't employ very many people. The data center that I referred to in Malhada, which is one single data center on this vast complex of other data centers, which is the size of the Aviva football stadium, Ireland's national stadium in Dublin, will employ about 16 people when it's built. So it's huge facilities, employ a very small amount of people, and it will consume more electricity than Galway, which is Ireland's second largest city. So it's also very, very difficult to get into a data center. They're very, very secure facilities, but this is not generally what you find when you go into a data center. Some of our team have visited data centers.
And does that mean you weren't able to share the photograph from your real data center visits? Are you sworn to secrecy, for example?
Oh yeah, no, totally. Yeah, we wouldn't have been allowed to do that. But it's also, I mean, data centers play a significant role in the story, a significant role in our research, but they're only one part of the story, one part of this entangled story of data infrastructure. And architects generally like to sort of sway towards buildings and things that kind of manifest above ground. We're saying, well, yes, however, you can't consider this subject matter without considering both the places and the processes take place.
Yeah, it seems a very interesting term as well, thinking about the term entanglement and how I almost start to think about all of these networks and systems as sort of being the roots of the tree, except for perhaps a more insidious an insidious thing than a tree as a metaphor. Linked to that, there's another comment in the chat from Grant Morris asking or saying it seems like there's a direct correlation between these data centers and the climate crisis that we're dealing with currently.
Well, yeah, 100%. It's again, it's not data centers as physical objects in the urban environment are a huge contributor to fossil fuel consumption. Massive. However, this is being driven by the exponential growth of data consumption. So the one can't be considered without the other. But also, artificial intelligence as well, machine learning. Increasingly, as say something like 5G is deployed across the nation, that requires more increasingly complex machine learning algorithms to power those systems. And just one very basic machine learning algorithm, when deployed in that kind of context, produces the equivalent of 125 round flights from London to Beijing in terms of a carbon footprint. So that's just one. So I mean, it's not just about data centers, it's also about the very processes and the power that's needed to process many of these kind of complex data interactions that we now need to get by in everyday life.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And then it's fascinating, isn't it? There's this continuous move to digital, continuously save trees, don't print on paper, keep things in the digital realm, and actually trying to work out the comparisons between the energy uses of different approaches is actually not at all straightforward. I've got another question here from Lucas, which is just, do you think that the digital public space as an overlay on the real public space is less contested and therefore increasingly impacts on the contested nature of that real public space? In other words, does it make it even less public?
Well, we would first probably come back and say the digital is real. I think that's what our project's about. It's about saying there isn't this sort of ethereal, fluffy white thing called the cloud where all this stuff magically kind of happens. These are real places with real processes and real mineral extraction from the earth that powers all downloading. But I think the question, if I understand the question correctly, I think that forms of digital interaction and digital mediation and representations of space, representations of the other via contemporary digital technologies, it creates new complexities when we want to talk about public space, when we want to talk about what it means to perform everyday life. And I think primarily, this isn't to say, I mean, technological advances have always produced space. Okay, I mean, if you go back to the invention of the railway engine, of the steam engine, if you look back at kind of early reports of passenger experiences of these new pieces of technology as they kind of punctured the countryside at speeds that people hadn't experienced before, you hear reports of new kinds of trauma, new kinds of psychological conditions, of new kinds of experiences of time and space, and actually of new kind of physical manifestations of the shapes of cities radically changing because of this new piece of technology. I mean, technology's always produced space one way or another. I think the difference with these kinds of things is that we are now mediating things at the speed of light, often faster than the speed of human cognition. And when these kinds of things, as people like Catherine Hayes have shown, that when these kinds of things mediate information and are able to compute faster than you're able to think, that has serious implications. And I think that transfers into the conversation about public space too. That's a kind of roundabout way of answering what I think was the question.
Well, I also, it sort of brings us on to the next question in another roundabout way, which is sort of thinking about the link between the technologies and the architectural expression and material production as a result. So Alessandro was just reflecting back to that rubber plantation that you showed and thinking about that grey rubber used to insulate the original structure, which were, I think you said, using Malaysian trees as a source. Was that, he asked whether that was an existing trade or manufacturing process, or did it emerge specifically for the transatlantic telecom system?
No, it was an existing process. There's a really interesting there's a really interesting essay on this. I can't remember exactly what the essay title is called, but it's where I got the phrase Victorian ecological disaster from, and it traces the history of the gutta percha trade, but also then how it was appropriated to be used to insulate the cable. So it was used for other purposes as well, as far as I can remember and understand.
Okay, and then the next question comes from Mike. Do you think there's any value in a close study of the data center as a typology, the ways in which it relates to its immediate conditions, in the same way that you were interested in the material of the transatlantic cable? So the post-war infrastructure group at Manchester have been making some interesting studies of power stations in their settings as an increasingly changing or lost building typology.
Yeah, I mean, this is work that's being done. My colleague Donal Lally, his research is completely focused on this. There's a unit at the RCA led by Ipa Laparelli, formerly of OMA, who's doing some research into that. In the book as well, there's a stack of stuff in there that is kind of doing that. I think from our perspective, we feel maybe we're going to pivot away from that a little bit and begin to explore more, particularly in my research, the processes and the kinds of spaces that they are producing, and how those spaces may or may not impinge on our democratic right to the city, our right to the production of space. So there's loads of work being done on that. I can send some of that your way if you're interested.
Thanks so much, David. I think that I guess your talk and the discussion subsequently has really made me think about the book E.M. Forster's When the Machine Stops. I don't know whether you're aware of it, but it's something that I was directed towards at the start of the pandemic, and some kind of written at the turn of the last century, I think, and really predicting pretty much the scenario we find ourselves in now. And there's almost this feeling that this entanglement and this infrastructure that creates our lives is almost our breathing heart and lungs, are the things that keep the machine that keeps our contemporary lives functioning, particularly in this kind of pandemic world. And the question then becomes, what happens if it stops? And how much of our systems are entirely reliant on these on these structures and systems, you know, from hospital, you know, to, I don't know, turning the power on and off in all of our infrastructure. Not really a question, is it? Observation.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's not a book that I've read, so I can't comment directly on that. But I think the questions we're posing lean towards those questions that you've just asked, and in particular, we need collaborative expertise to ask not questions about how will we live without this stuff, because it's not going anywhere, but how will we live with this stuff, which is also bizarrely the curatorial theme of the Venice Biennale. How will we live together? We've asked to propose either provocations or solutions to that question. So we've proposed a provocation, and yeah, would encourage those with the appropriate expertise to tackle some of those. But like I said, it requires a multidisciplinary response. Great,
thanks. I'm going to ask one more question, David, and then I think that we will bring it to a close, because I really appreciate the time that you've given to us, and the time that everybody has for their lunch breaks often. So Jayling's asked, if the thermal drone scans, she wonders how that data will be archived and considering the creation of that in the Irish Pavilion, as well as how you consider the new tech in the future by planning authorities.
Yeah, okay, so well, that footage is what you can see on this image here being presented on these screens. So there's a collection of black and white imagery of data centers, and there's a collection of thermal imagery of data centers. In terms of how it will be archived, does Jayling mean after the exhibition, or I'm not quite sure I understand that bit of the question.
Yes, after exhibition.
I don't know. We haven't got that far yet. This exhibition closes in November, and then we will be showing this at Transmedial in Berlin, and then we have to take it on tour across 2 venues in Ireland next year. So it's got a bit of life in it yet. So it's not a question we've considered.
Okay, I'm going to bring the talk to a close, and just say many thanks to you, David. I'm sure that you could hear the crowds in the talk, you know, clapping in their home spaces. But just thanks so much for a really fascinating project and a really interesting discussion. Covered some kind of broad and varied ground. I feel like maybe the next connection is to think about our own individual bodies in connection to these wider networks, our cyborg selves. In the meantime, just, yeah, thanks for your attendance and good luck with whatever you're up to this afternoon.